Hi, I'm Andrew Torget with Texas History for Teachers. Susanna Dickinson is best known as a survivor of the Alamo, but she survived much more of the Texas Revolution, and so her story helps us understand how the war was a much bigger story than just the Alamo itself. Let me tell you a little bit about Susanna. She was born in Tennessee, so she's a Southern woman. And she came to Texas in the early 1820s with her husband, Alamo, when they moved to what was then really the far western frontier of Anglo-American settlement. They had gone to the colony of a guy named Green DeWitt, who had a colony just to the west of Stephen F. Austin's. And they settled in the town of Gonzales, which was a tiny little hamlet in the middle of nowhere. They built a little log cabin, and they had a really little family, and were trying to make themselves a life out here on the far-flung frontier. During the summer of 1835, right before the Texas Revolution begins, Susanna she's a young woman, she's 20 years old, and she has a really young daughter named Angelina, who is an infant and been born just a few months before. She's trying to survive in a really difficult, challenging set of circumstances. And then the Texas Revolution comes and surrounds her and her life with an obscene amount of chaos. And so Susanna is actually in Gonzales when the very first battle of the Texas Revolution happens on October 2nd, 1835, which is known as the Battle of Gonzales. And this happened because there were some Mexican cavalrymen who had been sent from San Antonio to reclaim a cannon that had been lent to the Gonzales settlers by the Mexican government. The settlers in Gonzales decided they weren't going to give that cannon back. They challenged the Mexican cavalrymen, they made a flag that says come and take it, and there was a battle that happened that ended up having 2 Mexican cavalrymen killed. And this is the spark that begins the Texas Revolution. Susanna's in town when this happens, and her husband, Alamo, is involved in this fighting from the very beginning. And then her husband decides that he's going to be a part of this revolution as it plays out. So in the aftermath of the Battle of Gonzales, Susanna's husband leaves to go to war. He goes to San Antonio with other Texas volunteers, where they challenge the Mexican army under the leadership of Santa Anna's men. And Susanna's left by herself on this far-flung frontier with a little baby infant in her arms, and is left to her own devices and to protect herself. And a lot of violence comes through the region during that time that really threatens her. For example, there are a lot of American volunteers who make their way out towards San Antonio to be a part of the fight. And when they come through Gonzales, a few of these guys decide to break into houses. Maybe they're looking for supplies, maybe they're looking for things they need. For whatever reason, they bust into a whole lot of houses and in some cases assault some of the women who have been left behind, including Susanna. From the very beginning, Susanna feels extremely threatened by all of this that's happening in the Texas Revolution, and so she sends word to her husband, Alamo, in San Antonio of what's happened, that their home had been broken into. And so Alamo decides that the safest thing is to bring Susanna and their daughter Angelina over to San Antonio for their own safety and security. So Susanna goes to San Antonio in December 1835 precisely to get away from the violence and the chaos of the Texas Revolution. That's why she's in San Antonio in February of 1836, when Santa Anna's army comes marching in to town on February 23rd, and all of San Antonio erupts into chaos and fear. And everybody who's been surprised that Santa Anna's army is here this soon retreats east out of town, and they go into this Alamo complex, this old mission on the east side of town, as pretty much the only place they can go to hide in safety. And so Susanna goes in, Angelina, their daughter, goes in, and Alamo goes in as an artillerist into the Texas fortifications. Susanna is not the only woman who goes into the Alamo complex. There were about a half dozen Hispanic women, Mexicans native to Texas, who we usually call Tejanas. Also in the Alamo, there was Juana Navarro. She and her sister had come into the Alamo complex with Susanna and all the other people from San Antonio. And there were several other children as well, besides Angelina, in the Alamo complex. And all these non-combatants experienced all the horrors and the terrors of the siege that happened over the next 13 days. Most of them were in the Alamo Chapel and some of the surrounding buildings. They were not out in the courtyard, but they heard all of the fighting that happened over those 13 days. Santa Anna's army was lobbing cannonballs into the Alamo complex for the entire siege. And people like Susanna experienced all the fears of, are we going to live? Are we going to die? Are we ever going to get reinforced? Are we going to run out of food? All the terrors that we think of the defenders of the Alamo, people like Susanna experienced those as well. And then Susanna experienced the horrors of the final assault on the Alamo that happened in the pre-dawn darkness of March 6, 1836. So you can imagine the scene right here, right? Everybody in the Alamo complex was asleep, so Susanna was presumably asleep when the assault began, she and Angelina. And it's dark outside, you can't see anything. So she's in this room all by herself with her daughter, and there's an enormous roar that starts happening out in the courtyard as this battle just breaks out outside of her door. And she can hear the fighting and the screaming and the killing and the screams of everybody involved throughout this entire fight. Susanna later testified that she saw, quote, no part of the fight, although she could distinctly hear it. And then Juana Navarro, who did survive all this as well, later recalled that she could, quote, hear the noise of the conflict, the roar of the artillery, which is to say the cannons, the rattle of the small arms, which is to say pistols and things like that, and the shouts of the combatants and the groans of the dying, right? You can imagine hearing all of that and being terrified throughout all of it about whether or not you're going to live or you're going to die. They have no idea if they're going to be able to survive all of this. Well, at the end of the whole fight, Susanna actually did see somebody get killed, a man named Walker who ran to the back of the Alamo Chapel and was stabbed to death with bayonets by Mexican soldiers. After Walker's death, a Mexican officer found Susanna and brought her out. And we can imagine the scene she walks out into. There are just dead bodies everywhere, people dying on the ground, screams and groans everywhere she went. And one of those bodies is of her husband, whom she never, ever saw again. And she doesn't know what's going to happen to her. What ends up happening is that she's taken into San Antonio itself, and before she knows it, she's sitting across a table from Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna himself, the president of Mexico, the general of the army that just killed everybody in the Alamo, including her husband. And now she's sitting across from this man who has decided he wants to interview all the survivors. And when Susanna comes in, she's carrying Angelina, her little daughter, in her arms. And Santa Anna apparently instantly took an interest in Angelina and asked Susanna about her. You can imagine this. He asked if he could adopt Angelina and take her back with him to Mexico, where he promised to raise her in luxury. And Susanna, who pretty much has nothing left except her daughter at this point, says, no, this is my daughter, you can't have her. Santa Anna says, okay, well listen, I need you to take a message to the rest of Texas. And so Santa Anna wanted the rest of Texas to remember the Alamo, not for the reasons that we remember it today, but because he wanted it to be remembered as an example of what happened if you opposed his rule. And so he told Susanna to take a message to everybody else in Texas and tell them, quote, the treatment accorded rebels at the Alamo will be the treatment to which the remainder of the country will be subjected. Just to say, no quarter. No one's going to survive this. You oppose Santa Anna, you will die. And so Santa Anna then sends Susanna east. He gave her a blanket and 2 silver pesos, and they rode east with an escort toward the Anglo colonies. As they're making their way towards Gonzales, they ran into another survivor of the Alamo, a man named Joe, who had been the slave of William Barrett Travis, the commander of the Alamo. Joe had survived, and now he had escaped San Antonio and was also making his way east. They join up together and they make their way into Gonzales. And when they get to Gonzales, they run into General Sam Houston, who is now the commander of all Texas forces. And he had come to Gonzales because he was riding to relieve the Alamo, and he's building an army. And so it is Susanna who brings the message of what happened and that everyone had been killed. And so Houston, when he gets this, he realizes that he needs a bigger army, he needs a better trained army, and he needs more time. So he orders a strategic retreat back east, and he also orders the burning of Gonzales. And when he does that, something I always point out is that he is ordering the burning not just of the town, but of Susanna's home. And so Susanna lost everything in this fight. She lost her husband, she lost her home. All she has left is this little baby in her arms, but she has no way to support herself. And so she retreats east with the Texas Army with no assurances that she's going to survive or what her future is going to be. And her story matters because it reminds us that women were at the center of this war, and that some women, like Susanna, ended up making enormous sacrifices during the Texas Revolution.